either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to the Good, the Bad, and the Weird podcast. I'm Nicho.
And I'm Chris.
And finally, we are doing our first deep dive of Folktober.
Yay!
I've been very excited for our first deep dive, not only because, one, it's a Japanese movie, so of course I'm going to be interested in it,
yes.
But also the history behind its origin is a little complex, but it's very interesting at the same time.
Yes.
And it's steeped in an exchange between cultures between the U.S. and Japan.
Yes.
That movie being the anthology film series Kwaidan.
Yep.
Also looks like Kwaidan.
It does look
in
like
America. It
does look like Kwaidan, and I will not lie, I may have called it that for a good long time.
I've been calling it Kwaidan for a very long time, and I only recently found through the commentary that it's actually Kwaidan.
Yeah.
And it led me down a rabbit hole of the Hepburn romanization not being really recognized until like 1908. So
yeah.
the origin of this story of this series is around that time. So I can see why there was like a little mistranslation.
Definitely.
Yeah. So Kwaidan is based on the stories of Lafcadio Hern, aka Yakumo Kozumi, which is the name that he adopted after he moved to Japan.
Of course.
With screenplay by Yoko Mizuki and directed by Masaki Kobayashi.
Yes.
Legendary Kobayashi.
Very.
And there are too many stars to do it right now at the intro of our episode, but we will introduce the key players in each story as we get going. Yes,
as an anthology, it is broken up nicely, and this one, unlike some anthologies we've talked about, where it's like kind of just three people doing a bunch of stories, this one, each one feels like its own proper play. Exactly,
and we'll get into why that is in just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
First, the movie is credited to Lafcadio Hern, but still has it's made from stuff from his other writings as well. It's not just Kwaidan.
Yeah.
But as for the writer Mizuki, she's written a few movies, but I'm not familiar with any of her works, to be honest, unfortunately.
Me neither.
But Kobayashi, on the other hand, is one of the most prolific directors in Japanese cinema.
Yes.
Or maybe not prolific, but most famous because this was like his last major film he did.
Yeah.
But some might remember us talking long ago about Tatsuya Nakadai having to request permission from him to star as the antagonist in Yojimbo.
Yes.
While he was working on Kobayashi's The Human Condition. But also, we briefly mentioned, we covered another movie that he directed, the original Harakiri.
Yes.
That Takashi Miike redid.
Yes, of course.
And also one of his other favorites of mine is Samurai Rebellion.
Yes. Honestly, if you were watching enough older Japanese movies, you will have run into his works at some point, even if you don't necessarily, clock him as it, because he's got a fairly wide breadth of, what he does. The styling, I think, is fairly distinct.
It's all anti-war films, for the most part, besides Kwaidan.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Not Kwaidan.
No. But before we get into it, I do want to specify some of our sources for this episode. Commentary by film scholar Stephen Prince, Kwaidan by Lafcadio Hern,
of course,
Masaki Kobayashi, conversations with Masahiro Shino, interview with assistant director Kiyoshi Ogasawara,
yes,
and Christopher Benfree, editor of Lafcadio Hern, American Writings and Profiles Hern.
There you go.
And then for other notes from the rest of the series, since it's kicking off a new month, we'll be pulling from The Book of Yokai by Michael Dillon Foster.
A great resource.
Japandemonium Illustrated, the Yokai Encyclopedia of Toriyama Sekian, translated and annotated by Hiroku Yoda and Matt Alt.
Yes, of course.
Interview series, Hiding in Plain Sight, A Brief History of Yokai. The Yanagi Takunio Guide to Japanese Folktale, translated and edited by Fanny Hagen Meyer. Ancient Times in Modern Japan, an anthology of Japanese folk tales selected and translated by Fanny Hagen Meyer. Japanese Tales, edited and translated by Royal Tyler. Nihongi Chronicles of Japan, the earliest times to AD 697, translated by William George Ashton. And as well, when needed, the yokai.com.
A great source.
Yes.
I love it. I love cooking around.
Mm-hmm. And before we really even get into Kwaidan, I do want to talk about Lafcadio Hern just a little bit because
yes, please.
His history.
What a person. What a human.
Yes, yeah, he is and we're not going to go through his whole history because that's
you can't. We'd be here forever.
A whole episode in its own. But Kwaidan is an anthology of vengeful ghosts.
Of course.
And its name comes from Kai meaning strange and mysterious, and Dan suggesting an oral tradition. Something poignantly named because Lafcadio Hern's stories were becoming popular as oral traditions were being transitioned to a written system.
Sure. Makes sense.
I think the part of the reason I want to do this is Kwaidan is a great intro to Japanese folklore, and
definitely
it's an interesting, like I said previously, a back and forth of cultural exchange, as Lafcadio Hern was living in a modernizing Japan that he understood was necessary, but was upset it was ruining what he considered the true Japan that he loved.
We should say that with the caveat of he was not originally Japanese.
No. His very brief story of Lafcadio Hern. Born to Irish and Greek parents.
Yes.
Abandoned by both of them to live with an aunt in Ireland, he grew up non-religious in the 1800s.
An impressive feat, really.
Yeah. And just never got it. And then I started identifying more with like his Greek ancestry and his heritage and their belief system. And then he moved to the U.S., tried getting into news writing, and his first breakout was writing a little bit of a sensational article about a true crime murder case. As
everyone really these days is.
In Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, the booming metropolis.
Yep. Married a black woman. Got fired from his job because of that, worked at another newspaper, moved to New Orleans.
Yes, one does.
Got kind of involved in like the early jazz scene, divorced his wife, and then eventually moved to Japan where he married a woman there and started teaching and conveying stories. He didn't translate. Yes, Lafcadio Hern did not speak any Japanese.
No, despite living there, as best we know, he
probably knew minimal.
He could order, I bet. I bet he could order at a restaurant and ask where the library is.
Yeah, probably. But his wife would tell him these stories, and often what would happen is she would tell him the initial story, and then if he was interested, he'd have her retell it, and then he would write it down.
Very cool.
And also, what's interesting is, like, the Yanagita Kunio and his guide to Japanese folklore, they didn't want embellishments when the original telling of it, and that was so, at least in Hern's perspective, he could add the embellishments and flares that he wanted to make it his own.
Sure. I mean, that's a pretty standard oral, like, storytelling tradition anyway. You have your basic, but then everyone tells it just a little different. I mean, the Grimm's version of Cinderella is very different than Disney's.
Yes, and at the same time, Hern is compared to the Brothers Grimm and capturing the roots of the stories and bringing them to the masses.
Of course.
Whereas Yanagita Kunio, what he did was basically Cliff Note. So, like,
also necessary, but different.
Yeah. So the two sources, the Yanagita Kunio Guide to Japanese Folklore and Ancient Times in Modern Japan, basically very similar, but Ancient Times in Modern Japan is more what we would think of when we're reading stories of mythology.
Of course.
Or folklore. Like I mentioned, Hern wrote Kwaidan for an American audience.
That makes sense, especially, like, watching it as because it is very Japanese. Like, the movie's not overly Americanized by any means. But it's definitely not the same styling as what I would normally see. And I think it boils down to the stories being sensationalized a little bit.
Well, that's the other thing too, is when he brought them over to America, and then they came back to Japan, even with their slight tweaks, and became their own thing. Because in Kwaidan, there's the story of the Mujina, which are the faceless people of, like, did they look like me, and then or look like this and have no face? Yeah,
just smooth, hairless cat face.
Yeah, or like what we talked about in Pompoko.
Yeah, Pompoko's a great example of the faceless look.
Again, that shows the cultural significance and influence of Hern's writings coming back around to Japan and becoming their own thing within it and being accepted within, again, that melding of cultures that it's this weird back and forth, not a weird back and forth, but an interesting back and forth.
Yes.
That
a trading of traditions in a way.
Yeah, just a little bit. And so that's when Kobayashi comes in and re-Japanified Hearn's writings into his movie.
Makes sense.
As well, while Kwaidan is a horror film by all means and purposes.
I say it is labeled as one.
Hearn's writings were not intentionally horror stories. They were more documentation of strange stories intended without a moral lesson, though I don't agree with that 100%. There was a couple stories, specifically the first two, that I will argue are definitely have a moral compass to the story, whereas some of the other ones are just tales of warning with no real morality or why you shouldn't do it. Just don't do this.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And of which we are covering Kobayashi's definitive cut, which he chose 4 stories that all worked well together from Hearn's writings.
Yes.
Blending a couple together and then pulling from other books and whatnot.
Definitely.
And before we get into it, Chris, what are we drinking today?
We have, of course, tea.
Yeah, because it kind of ties into the whole narrative and the end of the movie.
And we finally hit fall, so it's time for a nice warm beverage.
Yes.
Cheers. Delicious.
Yeah, it's tension tamer.
It's tea.
Yep. But before these stories even kick off in Kwaidan, I think it has such a cool opening with the silence and the ink and water and the slight chimes here and there.
Yes.
It's kind of an odd opening credits, but it works in that ethereal, like abstract, ominous tone that it sets for the rest of the movie that continues throughout with how the music's done and not necessarily the cinematography, but it sets up that eeriness of like you're about to watch something that's not of this world per se.
I also think it adds like a really nice, like almost beginning of a stage play sort of effect where you feel like it's kind of the music to tell you to like, all right, time to settle down, time to get ready to listen to the spooky tales sort of thing. And I think it also helps set the tone, especially the music paired with the imagery. It helps prepare you for an anthology. Because I think that is a lot of anthologies' problems, is unless you, like, pre-game and ready yourself before you go in, we're so not used to watching anthologies, as a general rule, that you're kind of, you know, either left a little bit hungry throughout, or you're a little bit, like, confused as it goes until you really get in the groove. And that's wasting movie time. This sets the stage for you right away. You kind of get that sense of, like, okay, these are brief plays, these are brief stories.
Yeah, and it's not like the first VHS movie that has it integrate the mini tapes or mini films integrated into the overall story.
Exactly.
And that one does a good job of setting that up of, hey, you're going to get into an anthology once you start watching it. But yeah, I that's a good point you bring up because I never really thought about anthologies. Because usually when I'm watching an anthology, I know it's an anthology ahead of time.
Yeah, because you have to seek it out.
Yeah, and it's not just like pressing play on, this movie looks good, and then you're like, wait, why is this story so short?
True, and I think it's a bit of a downfall to anthologies because they are very good usually, and I think more people would get into them. I think there is a large enough audience who are interested in the more inspired and like singular stories. The more like there's definitely a craving for more like freeform and without like no remakes, no like we're not taking this story and twisting it to like fit to general audience. Like there's enough people who crave that. But anthologies get overlooked because honestly, you do have to go out and hunt them down. Usually the way they're set up is, you know, not necessarily bad, but unless you're an anthology experienced person, you have to get into it. And by the time you're into it, you've wasted a bit of movie that you could have just been enjoying. Yeah, and enjoying in parts too. It's not like Kurosawa's Dreams, which we did with SP Film Viewers. Go check that out. Where it was one single vision. Compared to this, where it is one single vision, but it's also filtered through 2 or 3 times where we're getting this iteration of it, where you could see it being told in a different way. And I would say this feels more like a box set of VHS tapes that happens to all be playing on one DVD, as opposed to Dreams, which felt more like a chapter book that was like running through the stories. Yeah, or like Mushishi, that is supposed to be an anthology series where they attempted to mash it all together in a way that didn't work well, or Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which I think Scary Stories is a good example. But I think that one did a good job of taking the short stories and just inserting them where it was. I won't say convenient. No, because it wasn't. Where it worked well with the rest of the movie. I agree. Yeah.
And that's also seen in The Black Hair, which is a combination of two stories from Lafcadio Hearn's works.
Definitely. One of the stories we've kind of explored already. A little bit in Dreams. There's a few of the background characters that they are not direct, because we can't definitely say that. But there are some recurring themes throughout Japanese tales that I think are just cornerstone pieces to their stories. The treatment of wife is a cornerstone one.
Yeah, well, and we gotta remember that a lot of these old folk tales, specifically like the ones from the Sengoku era and a bit in the Edo period as well, is that the women mostly aren't named, and if they are, they're daughter of sister of, wife of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting that despite that being the norm, so many stories revolve around this idea, this almost like belief that if you are mean, if you are poor to, wife of, not even a name, but if you are poor to her, bad things might come.
This is the one that one of the two that has a moral.
I very much think it has a moral. I was kind of surprised when he was like, no, like, they're just stories. And I was like, no, this one definitely is, if anything, teaching me that I must be good to wife.
Yeah. And for those curious about why hair is in so much of Japanese folklore, there is not an answer. It's been in it for so damn long that it's just there. And there's been that focus on it probably stems from some focus on the beauty of like your hair is like your pride and your treasure.
Sure. And they definitely in Japan, but also just in Asian like culture, it seems that there is more of an emphasis on hairstyles being depicting of time, class, money, which makes sense. Like, you had time and money, but we had more focus on clothing and possessions
and wigs, because they were going bald because of syphilis.
And also there was a gigantic lice problem, and we were maybe not as bathing as we could have been.
No, the Vikings were disgusting because they bathed every Sunday.
The Vikings were less disgusting than the English, though. Many women left their English husbands for the Vikings because they were less nasty.
Yeah.
Which doesn't bode well.
No. But The Black Hair, it stars Rentaro Mikuni as husband, Michio Aratama as first wife.
Yes, wife one.
Misako Watanabe as second wife.
Wife two.
Rentaro was also in Harakiri.
Of course.
Aratamo is Michiko in the Human Condition trilogy.
Oh, okay.
And Ohama in The Sword of Doom. 2 movies starring Tatsuya Nakadai, who we'll talk about later on.
Yeah.
And Watanabe was Takashita in Youth of the Beast.
I haven't seen that one, but I will look it up.
It's also on Criterion, if I remember right.
Of course, so I will look it up later with money.
Yeah. So, The Black Hair is a story about a samurai of lower status leaving his wife to seek out a higher position through marrying a quote-unquote better-off woman.
Yes.
Only to pine for the woman he's left behind, and upon returning, finds her alive and spends the night, only in the morning to find he has awakened with a dead body and the hair sucks the life out of him.
This story boils down to the same moral that many a rap song really hits home with. Don't be a gold digger.
Oh, I was thinking 99 Problems.
I mean, he also has none. He is dead. But also, don't be a gold digger. Don't date gold diggers. They're always problems. And this man, essentially what it is, because while we, as a more modern audience, I definitely, the first time I watched it, took away the moral of be good to wife. And I took that away partially because we've been doing a few pre-game movies. Yeah. And the theme of be good to wife is in a few of them. And so I had, like, prepped myself. That was, like, the mindset I was in. However, after rewatching it again, I did make a note.
Okay.
Despite my notes being dead because my laptop pooped out on me. But I did make a note that while I still hold that, and while I still think it's a valid interpretation, I think when you boil it down, it is not necessarily be good to wife. It is more, do not chase money.
Yeah.
Hold morals, hold your truth. But it is less about, like, wow, he gypped his old wife.
Well, okay, so here's the thing is, I get the gold digger bit.
I do too.
But I don't think it's 100% that, because...
No, it definitely is not. It's just an angle.
Yeah, husband does say that it is the goal of all men to seek power and position, and where
yes.
it's kind of gold diggery.
It is.
It's more. What's the right way to say it? It's
a little cougary, but in a backwards way.
What?
He's looking for the next biggest best thing, right? Like
Yeah.
he's jumping ladders, he's jumping ships to try and jump up higher. And his current wife, she's not. I mean, she's nice,
She's
but
pretty.
She's pretty enough.
She's got nice hair. That it focuses on a lot.
It does. Yes, the camera work is very like blunt
in
its way, but I kind of like that it's blunt because again, like this whole set, this whole 4 series feels like a play. And so having that camera kind of focus in on the certain aspects that they'd be highlighting with lighting normally, or even maybe a narrator pointing it out, I really like that.
Well, and that's the thing too. Like, well, that real quick about the husband is
yes,
like it is very much so the ambitions of men can't be held back by women folk, and they'll take whatever means it can.
That's definitely what husband thinks.
Yeah,
very strongly for sure.
Yeah. But the narration I really like because it's almost like a story being told around a campfire to scare children, or
yes,
in the 100 stories that we talked about in our last micro view, Yokai Monsters, 100 Monsters.
Yes, no, I completely agree. This very much reads as a story, not just as a movie, and I
yes.
love it.
It's definitely a good way of setting up the mood and explaining the mood of it all without knowing like where this is going, because that narration really ties in, especially in the last story of the movie.
I completely agree.
And not only the narration, but the worn down house, the setting of the spooky mood, silent and unsettling. There's the camera angles are like looming over everything. There's those shots from above. They remind me of like, again, reading from a book or observing from above. Also, Prince mentioned that the shots are like emakimono picture scrolls, which, for those who don't know, was a type of picture scroll that originated in China that stylistically have lines parallel to the edge of the scroll, and then everything is angled back. Yeah. Kind of like an axonometric drawing, but
more cartooned, I feel.
Yes.
Yeah, a little flatter, but yes.
Exactly. But not only is it setting up like the angles and everything, is the focus on the hair. Yes,
it's perfect because it feels like that foreshadowing little bits that even though because you've been told the name and you know this is a horror, so obviously like
they're gonna play into it.
They're gonna play into it. It is spooky, but it's not spooky in the same way of like modern horror by any means. It's very like almost Goosebumps-esque in some capacity.
I wouldn't even call. So here's the thing: is like I know we've referred to stuff as being Goosebumpsy, but I don't feel this one falls under that. And that's how a lot of like folklore is to me, where that part of it is because Goosebumps is 100% a work of fiction that we read as kids and get terrified. Sure. But whereas like we read these folklore, and the folklore is you feel that like bit that it was real to people at one time.
Sure. No, I feel the goosebumpness for me anyway comes in where this is definitely, I can see the roots, and yet the thing that is the spook is so outlandish that it hits into that goosebump realm of like, wow, we've really like, because that's what kids are scared of. They're not scared of like, existential dread. They're scared of the dark, the bumps, the things that they can kind of see but not fully understand.
The things that they can imagine.
And this, I think, plays into it, but at an adult level. And I really enjoy that, like, there is this trail for you to follow as you watch this little short bit. I call it short bit. This movie is very long.
This movie is about 3 hours long, and every single segment is about 40-some minutes.
Yes. No, I say short bit because we have 4 of these to get through.
Yeah.
But they're not truly a short bit. I definitely am glad I read the back of the box before planning out when I was going to be doing this, because I was originally under the impression that this was an hour and close to the 2 hour.
Like what you think of with the normal anthology movie, unless it's like ABCs of Death, that's about 3 hours in themselves too.
Exactly. No, I was assuming this was close to the 2 hour mark, like most anthologies. And so when I flipped the back of the box over and realized that I was going to watch this several times, I'm glad I planned out my life a little bit better, because also, this is the sort of anthology that my husband does not get into, which means that I really only have his patience to watch this in bed with my computer right before I fall asleep, like once.
Yeah. No, and I get that, and that's the thing is, like, I think this is one of those movies where it's better to watch what segments you want to watch, or watch each segment as, like, an episode of a movie or something.
So now that I've watched this a handful of times, and I've had to watch it a few different ways, my personal recommendation for getting through this one, specifically, is each night, each evening, with a different drink of choice, maybe a different tea, which would be appropriate, watch one of them. Yes. And just, like, 4 days in a row, watch one, because then you also have time to digest. Yeah. Because unlike a lot of the other anthologies we've talked about, where, like, honestly, watching it all in one big go helps, because you're kind of getting the full breadth of everything. This one, especially the way that it is divided into the 4, feels much like seasons, and you almost need a pause to enjoy it. Well,
and on top of that, Kobayashi definitely makes many embellishments that takes really, really short stories, like the story of the black hair really is only like a few pages long.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's condensed.
Yeah, but he draws it out in a good and suspenseful way where there's a lot of void in what he works with, and whether it's void of sound, void of any visual happenings. Like, that's the thing that what makes this movie stand out so much is kind of the experimental music, and I'm going to say music in parentheses.
No, it is qualified as music, but yes, no, I thoroughly enjoyed the sound and music mixing, because the extra effort into making the music, the sounds of people doing stuff, because it is dubbed over, essentially. Like, the actors are not the ones making the sound. It has been done on top of and timed. And it's done in such a way that it adds, like, that creak of a door, or the floorboard squeaking effect.
Well, and on top of that, too, it's not, like, synced with anything. It's just kind of happening around it. So it has this, like I said, this ethereal feel of it's not all in reality. Part of it's outside of our reality, or the reality of the movie itself.
And the way that this one's paired, because I know experimental music is not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah, Nat Trash isn't for most.
No, and this falls into the range of on the verge of experimental jazz at times. Like, in the weirdest way of, like fingers snapping in a dark club level. Experimental.
Well, what it is the music is taken from sound effects, and what it is just each sound effect is played separately, so there's not like when we watch a movie, you have the music, you have the sound of someone breathing, crushed gravel underneath their feet.
No, it doesn't go together, necessarily. No. And then the bits that are true music are instruments that we are not normally familiar with. There was an emphasis on trying to use more traditional sounds and tones.
Yeah, the clacking of the loom becomes this rhythm of nostalgia and memory for the samurai, to the point where, like, even though the movie focuses on his new wife's hair as well.
Yeah, she's also very pretty.
Yeah, it's just...
The grass is always greener for this man, isn't it?
No, that's exactly what it is. It's a warning story of don't neglect your wife and don't neglect the second wife.
True, yeah.
One thing I do also want to say is that I appreciate with this movie is, side note. Yeah. I like the arrow shooting scene because... Oh, yeah. But while we like a good sword fight, oftentimes I think in the West we forget that the samurai were also highly trained in other methods of war, including bow and spear, and we don't see that a lot in movies unless it's like Bloody Spear on Mount Fuji, Kagemusha, where there's masses of samurai and large epic battles.
Or even, like, trying to show off a samurai who's better than many others. So they're all coming at him with swords, and he's got the spear.
Or it's, I know it's based off of real historical documents, but the Samurai Trilogy about Miyamoto Musashi, he fights other people who don't just use swords, but Musashi is always with the sword.
Yes. No, it is not as traditional, especially if you're not like a samurai film accoutrement. I feel like you're just kind of stuck with the samurai sword, which is cool, but I do like this scene quite a lot.
Yeah. No, exactly. But it also has that build-up of him not being able to focus on his duties 100% too. Again, creating that rhythm of he's remembering the past and, just the memories of nostalgia and finding out that he knew what love was. He just was too stupid to realize it.
Yes. And I do appreciate too that while for him, the conclusion of him returning to his wife and that being the punishment of like, oh, well, now you've left both your wives. It also feels like a hollow injustice at times, because while he is getting punished, they are not reaping any benefits from this punishment.
No. Well, the second wife, we don't know what happens with her, but...
I mean, I assume she just continues on her rich, dainty life. But...
No, exactly.
Yeah.
But the return to the neglected house is great because it shows that overgrown, slightly haunting that it's not going to be what he thought it was. And even then, like, we talk about the creaking of the board feels artificial. It makes it even more creepy, which it makes me think of, like, some of the sound effects from, like, Silent Hill, or I'm currently playing Fatal Frame, where it's all over the place. But here's the thing, and why the sound effects are interesting in themselves, is one, they were made from the environment, as well as a prepared piano that was electronically altered post-editing.
I love it. And I also think that the way that it's edited, where, like, some of the sounds have a visual cue, but quite a few of them are almost musically played in time, so that way it just kind of sounds like randomness to an extent, but it doesn't ever feel too much like that. It always feels like the sounds an old house makes, where it just is constantly settling. There's always a branch hitting something somewhere, but you can't see it. It gives you that really deep uneasiness feeling that is hard to shake. Exactly.
And even then, when we do see the wife, like, the way everything is so hauntingly lit, and then it's just her in this room that's dark, and she's so well lit while we just focus on her hair right from the get-go.
Yes. And it almost feels like he's not even coming back to his wife. He's just coming back to this idea of her, and that's even that adds to his curse almost.
Yeah. And I honestly despise his regret, because his tormentation feels so half-assed and very romanticized of, I was a fool for having left you.
And I feel like the way that it is written is so, like, the way it's written and acted is so perfect, because it feels like the shitty ex who's, like, crawling back to your house.
Yes.
And, like, texting you at 2 a.m. drunk, being like, I didn't mean any of it. Like, it portrays that, but it maintains its styling. It maintains that, like, historical play sort of look, but getting that same feeling, that same concept across, regardless of who you are.
Well, and it also is there to make you feel really sorry for first wife, because she's saying she's regretful, and she shouldn't be.
No, this is not her fault.
Yeah,
she didn't do anything.
No, it makes her death that much more tragic. And here's the thing that makes it subtly foreboding, but also she's, even though she has her rage, or maybe not her rage, but her sorrow and lamentation. When he says that he wants to stay with her, and she says, we can only stay together only for a moment.
Yes.
It's that nice of, like, one last kind of, like, blessed, like, last nice thing she can do for her, because also, very nicely with the shadowing and the light of it, the shadow behind her also grows larger than him.
Yes. Yeah. And I also like the ending, because especially if you take a breath in between this one and the next, your adult brain can come up with so many more ifs and ands on the idea of coming back to dead zombie wife, in a way, like dead ghost wife.
It's not even dead ghost wife. Here's the thing. I
mean, she's full corpse.
Yeah, here's the thing is, like, we don't know, because the hair, this is where it gets really abstract, because the hair turns white, then turns black again, then it grows long, then it goes short, her robes change color, and it's like, it's that weird disorienting feeling of, like, we don't know what's happening, or we know why it's happening, but we don't understand. It's never explained of what this hair is, like what creature it is, because this is a combination of the black hair and also another story called The Corpse Rider, and they both have different conclusions to them. And on top of that, as he's running, the camera starts twisting, and we get, like, this great days of him trying to escape what he's done, and there's grinding sound effects as he dies, and it's just...
It's very good, especially for a movie that is labeled horror. For a lot of horror fans, I think maybe soft horror.
Yeah.
But because there is that eeriness and that build-up, it does still deliver. Like, you don't feel disappointed.
Yeah, and ending on the freeze frame, we don't need to see him die. We know where this is going.
And again, that not showing everything, leaving the audience to have that imagination at the end, adds to it, and then it also lets you think and stew about the idea of coming back and living with a corpse monster, essentially, and, like, the implications that could lead to.
Yeah, because if I remember, granted, I didn't take 100% notes of reading it, but basically what happens is he comes home, asks what happened to his wife, and they're like, oh yeah, she died because no one was around to take care of her. Her family's gone, and she just died alone.
Yeah, we didn't, nobody bothered, and she's just in there dead. And nobody touched the house either. She's just rotting.
No, exactly. And it's a great introduction to, like, this strangeness that is going to permeate through the rest of the movie that doesn't need explanation. That's the thing with a lot of these folktales is, while there are some that explain, like, why the sparrow has the white or tan vest on, or the woodpecker is looks so dolled up.
Yeah.
There's stories behind that, but there's stories like this where there's not answers or conclusions or any reasoning or explanation of why stuff's happening. Like,
yes, I completely agree.
Yeah, it just exists within its own world.
Yes.
Like I said, this one is a very good introduction to the start of, if you want to get into Japanese folklore or folk horror, this is like the best start to it, because you start with something weird before moving on to something even more classic.
I completely agree, and I also think that it does a nice job of wetting the whistle without feeling like you need to do a ton of research to appreciate any of it.
No.
You can watch this without knowing any of the background. Granted, knowing the background does add to the joy and fun.
No, here's the thing is, I don't think it does. Because
you got tired of researching?
No, never. But, like, the reason it does, I don't think it adds to it, is because they're so different, and even if you know the source material, it's Lafcadio Hearn's adaptation of the source material and his flares.
I just find him so interesting and strange.
He's a fascinating man.
He is, but I say you don't need any of the background knowledge that we've already given you, the little taste of, the little sampling. But it is fun to kind of have that in the back of your mind as you're watching this, knowing that this is the story that a man wrote down because his wife kind of told it to him, and then someone else kind of reworked it. Mm-hmm. Like, this is like a third or fourth iteration.
Not just reworked it, fused two stories together.
Exactly. And I think that's amazing, because you can, when you piece it apart, you could almost peel it back to where you want, but they come together so beautifully into this new story, which normally when that happens, we complain because it's, oh my gosh, no one writes anything original anymore. This is fun. This is a fun version of originality. No,
exactly. And even into the next story with the Yuki-onna, which, for those who remember our episode with SP Film Viewers on Dreams, we talked about this a little bit. The Yuki-onna is the woman of the snow.
Yeah, snow spookies.
Yeah. This one is starring Tatsuya Nakadai as Mino Kichi, and Keiko Kishi as Yuki and the Snow Woman.
Of course.
I don't need to introduce Kobayashi's poster child Nakadai at this point, I don't think.
No, in everything.
he's in The Human Condition and a bunch of stuff, whereas Kishi was also in Kobayashi's I Will Buy You, one of my favorite movies around baseball.
Nice.
The Thick-Walled Room, as well as Yasujiro Ozu's, another icon of Japanese cinema, one of the grandfathers of Japanese cinema, Early Spring, and the fantastic Twilight Samurai.
A wonderful one.
The story of Yuki-onna is a story of a pair of woodcutters taking refuge in a hut after being stranded to one side of the river, and a snowstorm is on its way. While they're taking shelter in the hut, a Yuki-onna, or Snow Woman, comes and kills the old man, but spares the younger of the two because he is so beautiful.
Oh, to be handsome.
Threatening that if he should ever tell anyone of this night, she will kill him instantly. Then, surviving the night, the young man slowly recovers and later runs into a woman, cleverly named Yuki.
Oh my goodness.
And the pair live a happy life, though Yuki never seems to age, and they have kiddos, and everything seems all bright and joyful until our protagonist slips and spills the bean one night because Yuki reminds him so much of that woman in the snow.
Yeah, this one, I can see where the moral bit comes in. Like, there is definitely a hinting there, but I also do understand much better on this one the idea of this is just a story.
Yeah, this is definitely just a story, and it makes me think of one of my favorite folklores about the monk who killed a snake with his male juice.
Yes, a delight.
And they're basically stories of don't tell. That one ends with he doesn't want to.
Keep things to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. But what's interesting is this story is not in the original international release due to having to be cut due to the time frames of the Cannes Festival of that year, because for some reason they were only accepting movies that had a 2-hour time limit for who knows whatever reason.
A weird rule, but okay.
Yeah. But what I think about is interesting about this one is whereas the last one felt very stage-like,
yes,
this one, while being even more stage-like,
yes,
has more of a dream stage quality to it. Because the cool winter woods with eyes materializing and the narrator setting the premise, there's many eyes, but there's one clearly that also looks a bit like a snowdrift. But they're everywhere. And I think that's what that's where like the personification of not just the snowstorm coming in, but the sky itself is watching you.
Yes. This one, I think, where the first one felt like a more standardized play, this one feels like a dream being projected onto a play. This one feels much more experimental in some ways, but I enjoy it. Whereas the first one, like, you could peel apart and look to see where things were, like, coming together, like, with the sound or with the music or with the camera angles. This one, you don't have to look very hard.
No.
It's pretty in your face.
Well, and it's also, it dives back a little bit to dreams as well, where it's the harrowing conditions and helplessness and just... We understand that feeling of being cold and not wanting to be out there. And it's like we brought up previously that yokai in the past have been means to describe phenomena or explain why certain things are the way they are.
Sure.
Whereas this one is, this one feels like explaining hypothermia. This person died from cold.
Oh, sure.
But we're attributing it to some greater being that sucked the life force out of them.
Yeah, why did the one guy die when the other one didn't, sort of mentality. Exactly.
And but the thing with that too is there is this level of slight artistic intent with everything that Kobayashi does with this. Again, the first time we see the Yuki-onna is with a back shot of her with her hair. Yeah. And even when she gets up, it's very stiff in her movements. It feels very play-like in it's haunting, but it's artfully haunting at the same time.
There were moments of this one that almost felt like maybe dancing was going to occur. Not like, oh my gosh, everything's fun and whimsical, but like the way it is presented feels like certain ballets. Where like, I'm waiting for a bunch of people dressed up as, snowflake swans to then leap across and explain to me the torment and the raging storm via dance.
Swan-like?
Plus a few others, but yes.
Okay. I'm sure everyone's aware that I'm not familiar with any of that crap.
That's okay, but it has that same seriousness in an artistic play sort of way where you hold yourself, how you, like, the movements are all themed and, like, carefully choreographed.
Well, and that's the thing, too. Like, I can also see this being off-putting for some people because it is so stage-like at times.
Sure, but I think it works partially because while this one, I think if this was a full, like a big full movie, it would be a lot to try and like digest through. Because while the story is very good and it is very interesting to see it as the characters change and to kind of wonder where the like horror element is in this one. This one is thankfully only 40-ish 5 minutes.
They're all about 45-ish minutes.
Yeah, so that kind of like tapers you out because you've now got a sample for how long these are with the first one, and you're like, oh, I can make it through this.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, too, is, like, it's the way she's portrayed with the light kind of sitting around, like, when she's sucking souls.
True.
But also, I thought it was interesting that the way she's portrayed is no eyebrows and black teeth.
Very pretty.
Very much like a new bride. Like we talked about in The Tale of the Princess Kaguya.
Exactly. And I also think that the way she holds herself translates from being stiff because of ice and snow monster to stiff because you are a very proper, like, I think one of the women talks very briefly about, like, oh, you're too good for this little town, you should go on. Like, you're clearly, like, well, you're well-mannered, you're smart, you could do well.
It's not that, it's, they bring up that she's never aged.
They do that as well. For sure, because especially after she's had, like, the third kid or something like that.
Yeah, they mentioned that she's not like the other country women.
No, and part of that is definitely the never aging. But it's also the way she holds herself is that stiff formality.
Yep.
Even when she's not the monster.
No, yeah, even when her tits are out is...
True.
There's still that formality that's happening all before that, because even with the warm summer colors, there's still that mythical look to the clouds and the eyes appearing here and there.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah, but this is like where there's like this is where it feels more stage-like than the previous segment, because like the hills feel like they built it up.
Flat.
Yeah.
Yes, no, everything feels like there's maybe 8 feet worth of stage.
But at the same time, like, if you watch, like, I'm gonna go back to Dreams, and you look at the peach trees, it feels like that landscape as well, just, you can tell one's artificial and one's not.
True. Yeah, no, I totally see it. I think in this instance, though, like, while it's definitely not for everyone, I almost preferred the overly stagedness of this, because this one lends itself less to the like fireside spooky story and to more of like that like artful mindset. Like it felt more like a stage play, where the others I think in this movie lend themselves more to being like the around the campfire, around the one flashlight sort of storytelling. Well,
because in the Black Hair, so much of it isn't stage like. The only parts where you really see the stage are when he's leaving leaving his first house, and you can see where it ends. Yeah. Everything else is taking place in a woods, or it's within a human constructed building.
And I also think that this one is the least horror element of the lot. Because the horror element is essentially this man loses the thing that he held dearest in a way.
No, the horror element is early on, then we forget about it for about 20 minutes.
Sure, but like that's such a great artistic way of thinking about horror, because eventually, the blow softens and the horror disappears, and it's just a memory.
Well, yes, because it's a memory to him, where when he does reveal to her that, hey, this is I remember this, and she goes off on him. That's where you realize that's where the horror comes back, in that we forget the past, or we end up.
We dampen it in a way where it's not because definitely like the first couple of years of his life, he took that oath very seriously not to tell anyone.
Dampens until it becomes an issue, because the moment she turns back into the Yuki-onna, there's that moment where it's like, you fool, and then it's like Gandalf when he's useful. Or no, it's like Gandalf when Frodo tempts him with the ring. Do not tempt me, and it gets big and scary.
It reminds you how powerful.
Exactly. And like when everything turns blue, the entire shack is covered in ice, and like you do, it's another one of those tales of where the woman is,
she's almost nature in a way.
She is, but it's also the tragic tale of the woman, because of the foolhardiness of men who can't keep their promises.
True.
The one can't keep the promise to the wife. This one's a vengeful spirit because he can't keep the promise to some spirit deity that now he's attached to. And it's because they have kids together that she can't kill him, because she knows these kids need to survive. And it goes back to that old-timey thing of the man is really, truly providing for them all.
True. Yeah. No, I think so.
But I also like that she leaves that lingering thread and it's not in his hands anymore. If he breaks the promise, or it is in his hands, but it's less so of like, if the kids have anything to complain, she will come back and kill him. So she's even changing the terms. And you do feel sorry for her, too, because she
seemed happy.
Yeah, she was trying to go against her nature to be happy with a mortal, basically, because as far as we know, the Yuki-onna are...
Yeah.
You can't kill them, because, like you said, they're nature themselves.
Exactly. They are the snowstorm.
And also just when she disappears, too. She's back to being Sniff, and she disappears in the snow with the largest of all the eyes watching over everything. Which
that's a good point.
It makes it feel even more ominous that she is watching to make sure that the kids are always happy. And it's true. It's also sad when he like leaves the sandals to her.
I know. It like this one is almost heartbreaking at times.
Yeah, because our protagonist isn't a bad guy.
No, he just can't keep his promise.
No, well, it's not. It's not even that he can't keep his promise 100%. It's just that it's a spirit being a little bit unreasonable.
True, but is that not the whole definition?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I will say the spirit in the first one is very reasonable.
Well, sure, but that one you could almost argue that the spirit is brought about by the unreasonableness of the man.
Yeah.
Whereas this one, like, unless he is the stupidest man alive, it's pretty obvious. Like, everyone in the village is like, wow, look at how hot your wife is after all this time and all them kids.
Yeah. Well, in the original story, they have 10 kids together.
Exactly.
So.
Even crazier.
Yeah.
And even he's like, oh, what's your name? Oh, the name of the monster. Oh my god.
Yeah, it's a Yukiona. Her name is Yuki.
It'd be the equivalent of, like, your next door neighbor who only comes out at night, dresses exclusively in capes, and his name happens to be Vlad.
It's like Trolls 2, where the town's just goblin backwards.
Yes. Yeah, like no one here is actually being fooled, I would hope.
No, but that's the thing with old storytelling, is it's trying to give you the warnings and give you information to be informed, because you don't have the visuals.
True.
They stem from people telling you the story.
That is true. That is true.
Exactly. And this is, of the tales, this is probably the most tragic.
I would agree. This one definitely got at my heartstrings, because also, at least the modern idea is that, spouses usually don't keep secrets, and yet that's the whole, backbone of their marriage, is essentially, I know the secret, don't tell me the secret.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
So, what's nice about Kwaidan is there's an intermission, too.
I do love the intermission, because I truly did use it.
The intermission on the DVD is you have to pause it, because the intermission is only 5 seconds, and then it's...
Yes, but it is useful in that I was like, oh yeah, you're right, now is a good time to break and go get a snack.
Yeah, because we've been through an entire movie length at this point.
We have, though it doesn't feel like it yet.
No. And I will say...
This movie doesn't drag until, honestly, this next one.
Yes, this next story, because it is a little bit all over the place. We're talking about Hoichi the Earless.
Yeah, this one was, honestly, maybe the hardest one to follow at times.
I don't
Partially because of how bored I got. I'm not gonna lie.
It is long, and especially doing multiple rewatches of this. There's a lot.
There is. I mean, this one's cool, though, don't get me wrong. I liked the staging on this.
The visuals of this scene became the selling marketing visuals for this movie.
And I totally understand why.
Yeah. So Hoichi the Earless is starring Katsuo Nakamura as Hoichi, Takashi Shimura as head priest,
of course,
and Tetsuro Tanba as warrior.
Okay.
Katsuo was God in 20th Century Boys trilogy.
Oh, hey.
Biwa Hoshi in Dororo.
Yes, I am familiar with that one.
And he was in Princess from the Moon, an adaptation of The Tale of the Princess Kaguya.
Well, we're back again.
Or The Bamboo Cutter. It shouldn't be The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, but...
But that's what most people know.
Yeah. As for Shimura, we have not had many opportunities to talk about this man, but he is a legendary actor in his own right, appearing in many of Kurosawa's films, including The Head Samurai and Seven Samurai.
As everyone knows that one.
Protagonist in Ikiru.
Yeah.
He was in Rashomon.
I love that one.
Kagemusha. As well as Godzilla.
At this point, I'm wondering who hasn't been in Godzilla.
A lot.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of Godzillas to pick from, so that helps.
Yeah, exactly. As for Tanba, he was Tiger Tanaka in You Only Live Twice, for you Bond fans.
Yes.
But he was also in Harakiri. He was the voice of the Cat King in The Cat Return.
Yes, my favorite one.
But more importantly, he was in a few Takashi Miike flicks, including Happiness of the Katakuris, Gozu, and Demon Pond.
There they are. There's the list.
There's more, but I stopped
Of course. Because once you're in one of his films, you're going to be in a lot of them, usually.
Yeah, it depends. If you're good enough.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. But Hoichi the Earless, for those unfamiliar, is a story about a blind monk who unknowingly becomes the secret biwa performer for the Heike because he's specifically good at playing the Tale of the Heike, a clan of samurai who are eradicated at the end of the Genpai War by the Genji tribe, and in doing so, he becomes more and more drawn into the afterlife, and once the head monk figures it out, has him covered in the Heart Sutra, but they miss his ears, so when the ghost samurai comes to take him away, he only sees his ears, and
rips them off his head.
To not disappoint his lord, he tears off the ears.
Yes. And to dumb down the first a bit, the way that the movie explains it visually, I think does a good job of explaining that this blind monk was essentially very good storyteller via song and what we would now think of like maybe a guitar.
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, it's a stringed instrument, but you also have to remember that back in this era, the blind people were often called Zatos.
Yes.
And they were either acupuncturists, masseurs, musicians, or storytellers.
Yes.
And the thing with this part too is that I think part of the reason it's so slow is because it's kind of divided in, I wouldn't say 2 parts, but the first 5 minutes...
2 parts.
Yeah, the first 5 minutes is silence and crashing of the waves with the biwa intro and storytelling of the narrative, or by the narrator. And it's the most stage-like that we've had so far in telling the story of the Heike and the Genji, interlaced with a more like art depictions of it.
I agree.
Which... The part of the reason there's like this fascination and this return to this battle multiple times, for those who have been listening to us for a long time, we did Mike's Sukiyaki Western Jingo, which is a play on the story.
Yeah.
But it's such a big battle because it was the end of imperial rule till the Edo period in Japan.
Yes.
Or till the end of the Edo period. And it's dramatic, brutal, and
long.
But it's only like 5 minutes. That's the thing. It's 5 minutes, but it feels so much longer because it's trying to explain all this while also bringing in some of the lore that even hundreds of years later, the Heike crabs, which have a face-like pattern on their shells, are supposed to carry the souls of the Heike clan lost at sea.
Yes. And it's also briefly explained why this is like a big multi-night event is because it takes a long time to fully sing the full tale of the battles.
Yes. Well, it's not just the tale of the battle, but it's the tale of the
everything.
Entire Genpai War.
Yeah, so it's essentially like if someone sat down and wrote a little song to explain all of the battles of World War II, which would take a minute.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting too is this scene is... It feels warm compared to much of the other side, outside of like the Yuki-onna appearing at dusk.
True. Yes, the colors are brighter here.
But it's also that... It's like how Dylan Foster organized the Book of Yokai, where it's about the in-between times, those transitional spaces between our world and the human world and other elements.
True. And I think the pacing on this one lends itself to almost a breath. In a way where, like, there is the clear divide between the first few minutes and the rest of the story. But then as the story progresses, there's multiple times where musically and visually we just kind of take a breath and a pause. Which does add to the length feel of it, but if you do take a proper intermission, that helps. Or, watch it on a different night.
No, exactly. And again, it goes back to this is one of the few anthologies I feel that is worth breaking up quite a bit.
I agree, especially because you have so much to digest with each one of these, and this one, because it feels a little longer, this one almost feels like a full movie, where the other ones were long, but they didn't feel as rounded as a standalone. Yeah. This one does. This one has a lot of things happening. There is like a full big arc almost in a way, and the breath and the pausing throughout gives it a pacing that's closer to what we're used to in a movie.
Yes, because this one also has a little bit more comedy interspaced with the other monks outside of it. So we get a focus.
And honestly, a little bit of dark humor because of the ears. Yeah, that sucks, but also it's a little funny.
A little funny. But, it gives us a little... I think part of it is outside of Hoichi, the head monk, and the warrior, we get a rounding out of some of the other characters. So, we have almost a full cast of characters.
Yes, as opposed to the idea of 1 or 2.
But the history portion is important in setting it up. If you're new to this, and you don't know about the Heike and the Genji.
Yes, that would be a big part to be missing.
Exactly, or why it's important that Hoichi's good at this at all.
True, and also why it takes multiple nights for him to tell the tale.
Well, and I think there's a few good things with this too, especially with making it feel like it could have been shorter, where after the first night and they can't find Hoichi, there's a body washed ashore, but it's a good misdirection that it's not Hoichi.
That's true.
And also just the way they make the samurai appear and the ghostly or not the ghostly procession, the ghostly audience, I think is so well done, where the first couple times we know something weird is going on because the gate they go through is blue. Everything feels like it's underwater.
Yeah.
And we know that the Heke sank.
Yeah.
And we also know that he's taking them to the Heke. But also when we first see them, Hoichi can't see any of this. But even when we see it, they feel like a more put together court system. They don't feel ghostly until much later on into the story.
I agree.
After he tells the portion of them dying is when that transitions over to, oh shit, they're ghosts and they're covered with arrows and shit.
Yes, and it looks so good, especially because like there could have been room for like some forgiveness for age of the film, but you don't need it. It all flows really nicely. Everything looks really good. It does have a bit of a stage play sort of vibe to it, but again, the movie so far has had that same feel, so I'm not upset. In fact, I prefer it.
Yeah. Well, and also on top of that, like, Hoichi gets his own little development of he is steadfast to keep his promise to the ghost that he's not going to tell what he's been doing. And on top of that, we get the progression of him getting worse and worse because every time they see him, he looks more ghostly, or they mention he's sleeping like the dead.
Yeah, where he's drifting away.
The other thing I appreciate, too, is regardless of all the stuff that's happening, is how gentle and sweet Hoichi and the head monk are, where the head monk is trying to be stern and trying to get it out of Hoichi, but he's like, if it's truly something you can't tell me, then I'll believe it. And it takes people following him in a storm to figure out. Him. Yeah. And this is the only part in the movie that really uses special effects with the ghost fires.
Yes, and while they do stand out, I don't think they look so bad as to be distracting. I feel like they fit in with the theming just fine. Yeah,
well, this story too also makes me think a little bit of the peach trunk or the peach trees in Dreams, where it's these fallen figures or fallen objects or people or living things want to be remembered for what they were, or be honored that they serve some purpose or something, or they fought to the end.
Exactly.
And honestly, with this scene too, the music is much more sensible than some of the previous ones.
But I also think that there is more meaning behind that, because this is one of the only pieces where music is part of the actual story itself. So if it was all just the inspired music that we've had the rest of the time, where it's adding to the mystique, the horror, the suspense, it wouldn't have necessarily felt the same, because we're supposed to be hearing Hoichi play in a way.
Yeah.
Where even if we're not truly listening to him sing and play, you need that vibe, you need that idea playing in the background to help, like, continue and connect the story of, like, this is a musical-based piece.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, too, this is why I like reading folklore, is because there are many commonalities between the two, where by obeying the entity, you are giving them some sort of power, and like you see that within the magical system. If like in Western magic, if you give someone your name or you follow what they tell you to do, that gives them some type of authority over you. And if you keep repeating that, you kind of lose that autonomy of being a human, and we see that visually through Hoichi and him becoming more and more death-like.
Oh, definitely.
But also, when they do figure out everything and they start covering him with the sutras, there's really cool scenes of him being covered.
Yeah, it looks dope.
But this is where we see like the combining of Buddhism and, in a way, Onryo, which are... This is where I do kind of want to talk about Onryo specifically, is their and Yurei, because ghosts tend to have this weird in-between in Japanese folklore, where at times they're yokai, at times they're not. Like, even the urban legends, like Teke Teke technically is a vengeful spirit, but it at the same time, like, it has its own like flair to it compared to like an actual ghost or a yurei, which
it's not a clear divide like it is here.
Yeah,
like, there's a big divide between ghost and monster, and we even have like some now more modern definitions of like different types of ghosts that we're trying to like agree upon as a collective folk, if you will. I know some people believe, but you know, as a collective folk. But it does not seem to be available in at least this story. It's very vague, and like I don't know. In a way, you don't need to know the specifics of how the monster operates for the story to continue.
Well, and there's different types of ghosts, too. There's ghosts that appear to you from someone who's living.
Mm-hmm.
There's ghosts that appear to you from someone who's just died or about to die.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we see those in American or European folklore as well, too.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's where all the haunted places are where lots of people either died or suffered.
No, exactly. And honestly, this is the part where we get the most comedy of some of the priests hiding.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
But I think the ghost vision is pretty cool, because even the ghost finds the floating ear strange.
Yes, that is true.
But here's why I think like the logic is, it's a little bit of a stretch, but I also appreciate it because it's trying to bridge the gap between the logic of the living and the logic of the dead. Because instead of cutting the ears off,
he just grabs them. Because
he thinks they're not attached to anything. They're just floating there. But so I have some thoughts on this too.
Okay.
So they forget his ears.
They do forget his ears.
They had to put sutras probably on his dick and balls too.
100% they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, every inch of this man has been written on.
But they forget the fucking ears.
But they forgot his ears. Which also sucks because the end of the movie, or the end of the story, does not end with him just like, oh, he dies because he's got no ears. Like, he just continues to play, and now he's super famous because he's blind and deaf.
Yeah, and even before that, but here's where I think the sound is interesting, is the one thing this movie does is when there's pain and suffering, it's portrayed by music or sound effects, because the whole anguish of Hoichi not screaming, being just absolutely tossed around by this ghost trying to tear off his ears, is all just this really droning, chanting music that almost sounds like priests praying a little bit.
No, I completely agree that it is meant to represent that idea of like holy prayer or chant or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but this one is one of the few that actually has a happy ending to it, because...
Yeah, you feel bad for the guy, but yeah, at least he's famous now.
Famous, but also the temple is prospering because a real lord has seen it. And we only really get the narrator at the beginning and the end of this.
True.
Which, it's a story similar to other folktales of getting rich at the end of, you did your duty, you suffered, and because you suffered and you were dutiful through it...
Yeah, you followed all the rules. Here you go.
Here's your happy ending.
Even if it sucks just a little bit.
Yeah, and you gotta be earless the rest of your life. At least you're still good with the biwa.
I would say, that is one of the nice things, is like, he doesn't get kicked out of the temple for being, you know...
Well, and it's because the head monk feels really bad because they show up in the morning.
They kind of were the problem.
Yeah,
they were the ones who did this.
Yeah, and he's like, I should have checked on them. And it's like, yeah, you probably should have, and maybe...
This feels like an important assignment for you not to have, really.
Yeah. And it's maybe a tale of double check your work.
Sure, that could be the moral for this one.
No, but it is an interesting one. But I do agree, it is, even though... And I did check the timeline on it. It is about as long as all the other stories.
Yeah, but it feels longer. And I think it's, again, the pacing.
But it's because it's broken up at the beginning, where we have 5 minutes that feels like 10, 15 minutes with all the storytelling and getting us caught up on the history.
Yes, it does.
And then you have the tale of Hoichi, which, like you said, has its pacing, and it's just... Yeah. It feels like there's an adaptation of 40 Arabian Nights, where, I can't remember, I watched it a long time ago as like a kid. Yeah. And it felt so long because like every single segment was like a mini-series.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And while I don't think that this is necessarily like the worst critique ever, especially for how much praise this entire series has, it is one of the interesting parts where like, the first time I watched this, I definitely watched all the way through. I didn't even really pause for the intermission. I just was like, quick, grab a drink, use the bathroom, come right back. The second time I did this one, I took my time. I really I spent time with each one of these and took breaks in between, or I paused fully. And that's when this one felt much less draining.
Yes.
To get through. The first time I struggled, and I honestly was like, there's more, because after this one, it immediately hits the next title card, and I was done.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing is, I ran into that too, of like, I rewatched it the first time, got through it. Yeah. And then the continuous rewatches definitely bog it down. And that's the thing is, I do not recommend watching this on repeat.
no, that was necessary for us,
Yeah.
not for you.
No, exactly. And that's the other thing, too, is, like, from there, this final story, In a Cup of Tea,
Yes.
feels so much shorter than the other three.
It really does.
Even though it's about the same time length.
And again, I think part of that is just the way the pacing and the way the story progresses. Because Hoichi, there's so many pauses, there's so many, like, breaks to take the time to watch the monks paint the words, or to listen to Hoichi, like, watch him play for a minute. And it feels like it's adding length, when in reality it's taking about the same amount of time, but you're not being visually stimulated the whole time.
Yes.
This one, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. So In a Cup of Tea stars Osamu Takazawa, and as the author / narrator, hint hint wink wink, and Kanamon Nakamura as Kanai, a guard. Osamu is in the 47 Ronin and Fires on the Plains, and Nakamura was in the older version of 47 Ronin.
Both, honestly, very good.
Yes. And his final story is about a man reading tales about a man who drinks a reflection and is haunted by the spirit of his emissaries, only for the story to be broken and cut short.
Yeah.
Which is why I think this is an interesting one.
Yes.
Is because now we're coming to the conclusion where we're realizing that the last three stories have just been the author or narrator reading these stories and just being entranced by this. And in a way, the narrator himself becomes Lafcadio Hern.
I completely agree. I also liked this one the most because this one, while the others had elements of a spook or a warning of some kind, this one feels the most like a standard scary story that I'm used to hearing here.
Yeah. It's also more contemporary because the start of it's set in the early 1900s, which is about the time Lafcadio Hern was translating and bringing the stories of Japan to America.
Definitely.
And it's also the narrator talking about his fascination with unfinished tales, much like how in Yanagi Takunyo's Guide to Japanese Folklore, there's references of here's the start of the tale, but there's no conclusion.
Yes.
Or there's the end of this tale, but we don't know how it starts.
Yes. And I love that.
And even then, he's like reading stories from supposedly 220 years ago.
Yeah.
And like it's I think there is a little morality to this one where the retainer breaks order to get water, and that's what sets it in motion. Is I get it. It's a weird happening. I can see where Lafcadio Hern was just recording.
Yeah, I can too.
With strange events or strange stories, because I would be weirded out too of like looking into a glass or a cup of water and constantly seeing someone's face getting closer and closer to me.
That is a good spook. However, this is not a unique spook.
No.
This used to be a party game, actually. There's two variations. One was a mirror that you held, and the other was the bowl of water. The mirror game, I think, was a little more popular because it's easier to cheese and then thus have more fun with the spook. But the iterations were you were either going to see the dead, or you were going to see your future love. Those were kind of the two iterations. It was a popular game in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, usually around Halloween. It eventually morphed into more of a children's party game, like a young teen party game, so like 13 to 15 sort of age range. But it started off as just kind of a standard parlor game trick to like, hey, you want to see if there's any ghosts? You want to play Mary, Mary, Mary? Like, yeah,
I can see it, but like I can see that being maybe an inspiration, but also
I don't think it's inspiration. I think they just like at the same time existed, and I think it's just humans being like mildly afraid of a reflection, and I love that. Like we're so good at distinguishing faces and like recognizing a face that I think it's one of those instances of like when you look in the mirror and you see not yourself, bum bum bum.
Well, I mean that implies that they have the ability, they have regular frequency to look at themselves, and
in this case, you know, the reflection in a cup.
Yeah, but I also love how the retainer, his reaction is just like, the fuck is this shit?
Yeah, I do appreciate how he's not that freaked out.
No, he's more annoyed than anything. Which
does make you wonder if maybe this guy's house is haunted all the time, and the retainer's just like, spooks again.
Well, what's interesting is, one, the spirit feels a bit playful, but also, the apparition is appearing at a time differently than the past 3 stories. This one, he's appearing in full daytime.
Yes.
But in a transition or a threshold between like sky and water.
True.
Like it's that weird threshold of reflection. That's more what it is.
And I was going to say that there's like a pretty common, and it seems to be fairly worldwide-ish as far as I've like been able to research. Granted, I haven't looked into everybody, but like reflections being a gateway to other, whether that be other world or like, you know, a reverse of ours or the spirit world or whatever that is, them being like, you know, portals in a way makes sense to people, apparently. Just across the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, you also see it in like Nobuhiko Obayashi's Houseu, where his daughter said, like, one of the inspirations behind that behind one of the ghost or spirit attacks, was his daughter asking, wouldn't you think it's weird if your reflection attacked you?
Yes.
And so that became a big part of that movie.
Yeah, no, I think just humans in general are spooked by reflections sometimes.
I mean, I've seen the videos of other animals trying to fight their reflections.
And I mean, we're not that far advanced from some of them.
No, I mean, look at how many martial arts and like sword and sorcery movies or John Wick movies where they have like halls of mirrors where they're turning the corner and it's just them, or it's the villain and they shoot it, but it's really the mirror.
How many, like, video games do you have to fight your shadow self, where it's just you, but evil?
Negascott.
Kingdom Hearts. Zelda.
Yeah.
Like, there's quite a few. It's a pretty common trope. The idea of, like, you being evil and you have to fight your own self.
Shadow Mario.
Exactly. There's so many examples.
Yeah. And that's a weird thing, too, because in this one, it's a reflection. And in those, it doesn't feel like the reflection outside of, like, Shadow Link coming out of a lake.
True. It's not the same.
But it has that same vein of the anti-us.
Yes.
Or like in Gurren Lagann, the anti-spiral people or the spiral people.
Exactly.
Or races. I mean, that's those terms. But yeah, I don't know. It is interesting too, because this movie does go from kind of a weirdness to even spookier bits, because the dude just appearing out of nowhere and double exposure fading in and out.
It does look cool.
With a weird, interesting clock that I don't know much about Japanese furniture, because we don't cover a lot of that in furniture classes, at least the intro ones I took.
Aha, I got you there.
Okay, tell me about this clock.
This is a clock that... So, clocks were not original to Japan.
No.
They were brought over when trade opened, and so this clock would have been a recreation that was Japaneseified. So, essentially, someone got a clock, took it apart and went, aha, got it, put it back together, built a new housing, or, you know, learned how to make clock, built housing. And so it is one of the first instances that we have where Japanese styling, woodworking, and furniture influences are directly influenced by Western, and having those two blend and intentionally blend. Because when furniture was starting to be passed back and forth, those things they wanted to hold on to the original look very strongly, because it kind of showed off like, oh, I have something from fill in blank here. And we did the same thing. Like when Japanese furniture was starting to be brought back out, it was very popular to leave it as it is and be like, look, I've got Japanese furniture or cups or plates or whatever it is.
I mean, you've seen my parents' furniture.
Yes. I mean, there's still a lot of examples. Our family has some, and they're like in the heirloom case or whatever, right?
The special plates that you don't touch.
Possibly also because of the lead paint. But yes.
Yeah.
And so, like, this was one of the only instances where it was encouraged by the makers to not just reproduce exactly, but to blend and start to incorporate the two, like, have them merge. And granted, there's a much longer history if you're interested in Japanese furniture and, like, cabinet making and, like, woodworking in general. It's a huge topic. I did several classes on it.
Art in general, too. I mean, Van Gogh was inspired by the ukiyo-es of the Edo period.
And Japan, more so than I think a lot of other countries, though at the time when everything is handmade, you have time to add art to things, whereas when everything's mass manufactured, you're so restricted by what the machine can do, you don't have time.
Unless it's ukiyo-e's, where that's like, well, we brought that up in the Great Yokai War. That was like one of the first mass-produced pieces of pop art.
Exactly. So, like, there is this greater interest in craft. And I think the clock shows it. And I also think that the main reason for the clock for the standard audience that this, like, movie was for was more of, like, to set the period and, like, understand when this story is taking place. Because it's kind of a timepiece in a way.
Yeah, now I'm curious to kind of go back and look at the clock and see if it was, like, at 4:44 or the witching hour of Japan. Or...
Definitely. I think the main purpose of the clock was, A, to give a sense of grandeur for the place that we're at. So, like, this isn't just, like, some starving artist. Like, this guy's good. Well, he can afford a clock.
He's the retainer of someone important, but... Also, I think it serves as something that feels out of place.
It does. It's got a weird central location, which honestly, like, granted, it's an important piece. Like, this is a big money spend sort of thing, so it's kind of a show-off piece, which I get. But the other thing is that, like, this clock is weirdly in a lot of the shots, and I do wonder if, like, people who, when this movie came out, would be able to recognize this clock and kind of, like, period piece it, kind of like how we do with Victorian stuff. Where, like, you can see Victorian costuming or, like, a Victorian interior. Yeah. And you're like, oh, I know what time period we're in. I don't need to be told anymore. Yeah. Because the rest of the tales from this movie can happen roughly throughout a time period.
I mean, we know when this takes place.
We do.
The movie tells us 100%, like, this is 220 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I kind of wonder if it's meant to be, like, a visual cue of time period.
Yeah.
Though I don't know if the normal audience would know that or not.
I also do wonder, like, what... Because that's the thing with this, is because we never get a conclusion to this story. The ghost just kind of shows up to, like, either give him a warning, or is he just there to mess with him?
Maybe he's just the house ghost. We don't know.
Well, he's not, because he's just like, you should know who I am. You caused me great damage earlier today.
This is true. Yeah, he just shows up and is like, all right, you ordered.
Yeah, and when he gets cut, he flees, and...
Yeah, it is strange.
It feels a little bit like a Cry Wolf
story. Yeah, or like maybe like the tale of a guy slowly going crazy.
Yeah, or just the start of it, because I mean he's told that he's not told. Just he's given a break because they're like, oh, you must be working too hard. So
yeah, you're starting to slip. Time to take time off.
Yeah, but he's visited by 3 very colorful visitors. And I mean, they just return, or they say that their master's going to return to pay his respects on the 16th, which feels a little bit like the Green Knight in Arthurian legend.
Sure, I can see it.
Where you struck me, so I'm going to strike you back. But it also goes nowhere because it's a fun fight with shadows and stuff, and the other guys, and we get spear action. So we've had spear, bow and arrow. Yeah, we haven't had sword.
No, not in this one. But again, this is, I mean, a bunch of tales, and it kind of makes sense that like we're not necessarily picking for the sword. You know, I think it's just a nice coincidence that we had all the others.
Yeah, it's the most action we've had all movie, and it ends with no conclusion or answer because the narrator also disappears, which at the same time, like, when I first watched this, I felt this was a really weak ending to the movie.
Sure.
But upon rewatching it, it is a nice bookend for the strange tales, where it's a strange tale within the strange, or the strange tales are within another strange tale.
No, I agree. I really enjoy this, like, version of, like, oh, it's all one big, like, everything's a tale, everything could be strange. Because this is honestly a more storybook play-esque style anthology than I think some of the others, especially ones that we've talked about more recently, where this one has almost like a way to close the book and like be done, to like be like, and that was the spooky stories, ooh, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. But it also leaves a bunch of other questions too of, what soul did the narrator drink?
It's true, we don't know.
But it also feels like that passing of the tales of this guy was so obsessed with tales that he became one himself.
Yes, I definitely can see that analogy. I also think that this one started me on the process of looking at this set with the idea of like, oh, I should be stopping in between each one to like have time to question stuff. Like, oh, there's not necessarily questions happening.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. And And I don't know if it's necessarily, like, meant to drive you to do that, but it definitely started me on the questions of, like, oh, so these stories aren't, like, complete necessarily. Like, there is room for question and room for exploration.
Yeah, or there's ties to other ones, because, like, the yearning for home stories they're similar stories of a sailor marrying a sea god and then missing his home, only to break his promise of he's not going to open the chest that ends up containing her soul, and now they can never be together.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it like I said, it's a like rewatching it. It is a nice, strange bookending to a series of or quadrilogy of strange tales.
I completely agree. I really enjoyed, especially this story. This one might have been my favorite, honestly, out of the group.
I can see that. But this was also the last of Kobayashi's epics. This almost bankrupted them. Of like it didn't get the same return as his other works.
I can understand, because while this is really good, there's definitely a lot of effort put into this. Mm-hmm. It's maybe not the most approachable, like, from the get-go. No. You gotta kind of be ready.
Yeah, I can kind of see that, but at the same time, I think it's better than a lot of other anthologies or more modern ones that are more, I'd say, on the verging on the side of urban legend or pure urban legend, but also having the same kind of influences. Like if you look at Ringu or Ju-on or Dark Water, there's hair involved in all of those.
For sure.
Or even more recent, Sion Sono's hair extensions. That Definitely. Is all about vanity and your hair turning against you.
Sure. The other thing
or some creature's hair turning against you.
I was sure. The other thing that I think I can understand why it hurt is because anthologies have always had a bit of a special circle. They've never really been the popular choice, even when stuff was shorter and you could stick a bunch of things together.
Unless you're Trick or Treat.
Sure, but even then, the way that most of us want a story to, like, wrap up nicely, have the character, like, because even Trick or Treat does wrap up with, like, oh, all the characters live in the same world, you know, so you get this feeling of, like, oh, everything's tied together. Most anthologies don't do that. That's not the point of them.
No.
And so, for the most part, they never do as good as a standard movie, especially when you're looking at tales that are not super popular and also not super unknown. Like, these aren't... they're reworks, they're definitely retellings, but the baseline is there. Like, this is the equivalent of, like, oh, a new Snow White. In some capacity. Granted, there's a lot of versions of Snow White, as we've seen, and that's not a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a selling point.
Well, and I think I'm on the opposite side of that, because I think if you're wanting a flavor for everything, this is the route to go.
I agree.
Don't get fully invested in one story. Get a little sampling of it. It's like going to a bazaar or some type of food event where they got little samplings.
Yes, little tapas for everything. No, I completely agree, and I think that's what this is great about. I'm just saying I can understand why they didn't make money on this one, at least not to start with, just because a general, especially movie theater paying audience, is not normally their go.
No. And I mean, I get that. It is a long movie. It is 3 hours.
It is a very long movie.
But...
And it's best if it's on, home play, if you can.
Yeah. But I think what makes this one unique is because of its stage-like qualities.
Yes.
Because of its experimental music, is that it makes it feel special and abstract compared to some of the other more traditional stories.
Yes. I also think that its play-likeness adds to the storytelling. While it is horror in many ways, it's not out-of-reach horror for most. I think like this is a great example of like the concepts being horror, not the visuals.
Yes.
And I think that's something that we are honestly missing a lot, especially nowadays.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is, like, I've heard people complain about the Babadook, where it's like, oh, it's a screaming child. I'm like, yeah, that's the entire point of this, is, like, the kid knows what's going on.
Yes.
This woman is dealing with mental issues, and the kid is trying to respond in the way a kid can.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I think the other thing that makes this really a worthwhile go is because everything is so individualized, there is a way to watch this for everyone. You can skip the ones that you just really aren't interested in if you really must. You can watch them individually. You can watch like one half of the movie one day, the other half the next, or even one each day if you'd like. And you don't need to research it.
No.
Which, honestly, a lot of anthologies, especially more modern ones, are either too artsy-fartsy, so you need to know who the director is, or, like, who the main actor is, and why we're doing all of this. Or, unfortunately, with a lot of the folk ones, especially not regionally to you folk ones, knowing at least some of the monsters makes a huge difference. This one you don't have to, and it's really nice.
Yeah, well, that's why I say it's a good introduction, is because you don't need to know that the first story is a combination of two stories.
Nope, it stands alone beautifully.
The Yuki-onna is self-explanatory, and there's multiple movies about the Yuki-onna.
Definitely.
The third one, you don't need to know that, hey, what the Heart Sutra is supposed to be.
Nope.
It tells you in 5 minutes, even though it feels longer, the story of the Heike and the Genji, so you don't have to go back and do your research and remember who the hell these people are supposed to be, or why we should care.
I completely agree.
And then even in the last one, it's just one of those weird, creepy tales that you would I could see that being in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
I completely agree.
So, like I said, this for me is one of the best introductions to Japanese folk horror that I can think of, or that I know of.
I agree, and I would honestly extend that to maybe this is a really good baby's first anthology. Granted, it's long, and it's maybe not your normal pick, but it's all nicely put together, and it's easier to watch.
Yeah, it's better than the ABCs of Death, where everything is so varied on what you want. This one, like Dreams, had a very clear artistic vision from the get-go, because despite, like we've talked about, many anthologies bring together multiple directors.
Yes.
This one is specifically, again, one director who knows what he's doing.
Yes, and while it is very beautifully done, it's not so artsy-fartsy that you feel like you are missing something because you're not in the know.
Exactly. And I know you briefly mentioned it, Chris, but which one of these segments would you say is one that, if you had to pick one, not necessarily your favorite, but one that you said is the must-watch of the four?
The must-watch for me is the first one, The Black Hair. I think it explains the idea of the spook, the horror very well. I think it has a very gripping and story. And while I understand that the idea that you don't need a moral is important to the backbone of these four, I like having a moral, even if the moral can be skewed in a few different ways.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that one gets a little bit too abstract and goes down that what's the term? Orientalism, where it's like, oh, it's so weird.
Yeah, where it gets overwritten a little bit.
Yeah, where it's just like, oh, it's weird because it's Japan, instead of like looking back at your own culture and being like, there's a lot of weird stuff about our own stuff.
For sure, I can totally see that.
Yeah, for me, I'm gonna have to go with the Yuki-onna because it is such a classic yokai.
It is so good.
You don't need an explanation of what it is. It's self-explanatory that, oh, it steals the warmth from someone and steals their soul.
Sure.
And you don't have, there's not that the abstraction in the story is in the environment, not in the story itself.
True, and honestly, so heartbreaking. Little tears every time.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, without recommendation, which one is your favorite?
Without recommendation, the last one is my favorite. I love the spooky element of it. I think it's fun having the whole narrator, storyteller wrapping up everything sort of like mindset. And also the idea of like, oh no, there's a body in the water. Like, how do you get in there? Like, that's, for me, fun.
Yeah, I like that one too because it does make me think of like cheesy martial art movies just a little bit. I think I'm going to go, even though I do recommend the second part being the best one to start off with.
Understandable.
The first part for me is my favorite just because it does get abstract. I like the weird cinematography of it.
I love the weird music instrument noise thing. I like that. It's fun.
No, exactly. So, Chris, at the end of it all, what do you rate Kwaidan?
This, for me, is a good weird. It's weird, but it's weird in the best way. And it's not weird in an off-putting or like, oh, warning before you get started. No, it's weird because these are old-timey folk tales. The monsters in them are weird, regardless of you are Japan or Germany or America. Like, old-timey folk tales, we are weird. And I think this is a great example of them. And it's good because this is a beautiful movie. Like, yes, it's dated, but it's really well done. It sounds really well. It still sounds really great. I enjoyed listening and trying to demystify the sound.
Decode.
Yes, decode. The sounds and the music and the visuals and how things were being put together. I really enjoyed the visuals of it. I thought it honestly aged very nicely, especially with the stage-like production of it. And so for me, it's just a solid good weird.
Yeah, And I think maybe it's just because I'm so accustomed to different folklores now and
Sure.
just learning about it that I don't 100% see the weirdness in it. I do think it's abstract, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But abstract does not necessarily make something quote-unquote weird.
Sure.
For me. I think this is a solid good rating.
I totally get it.
That, while I do suggest recommending watching in segments and not multiple rewatches, it has everything that I'm looking for in a folklore story without diving into like how modern folk, or not just modern folk horror, but modern horror in general, they have to find the origin of everything. Things just can't exist. It's not like Hellraiser where it's just like, oh, he found this mysterious box. They're like, oh, we have to find out why this thing's coming. And I think maybe that's why like something like this or It Follows have that good spooky feeling.
I agree.
Is because nothing's explained. It just exists within that reality.
I completely see it.
Yeah. So, would you recommend Kwaidan?
Yes, and almost without any caveats. The only thing is that it is technically a horror, but again, it's mostly in just the psychological sort of sense, and I think 99% of the population can handle it just fine.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is highly recommendable. I do think the audience is a little bit more niche, as I'm finding we're a little bit more of a niche podcast than I thought.
Sure.
But it is definitely one that if you're trying to get into Japanese folklore and lightly touch it, this is the one to do it. Just do it in segments. Don't...
It is long. That is the only caveat. It is honestly that intermission really should say, we'll see you tomorrow.
Yes. No, exactly. But now is the time of the show. Season 6 bingo. New season and a new game. Chris and I are playing bingo, and you can too. Rules for players are simple. 1 stamp per card per episode. Cards can be found on our socials at TGTBTW_podcast on Instagram and Threads, and TGTBTW podcast on Twitter. And you are free to email us at TGTBTWpodcast@gmail.com. You can use any of the 3 bingo card variations, but each stamp must be associated with this Season 6 episode. First place is already taken, so second place gets to choose a deep dive and 1 micro review. Third place gets to choose 2 micro reviews. And fourth and fifth place get to choose 1 micro review apiece.
Fantastic.
So feel free to share at us on social media or email us for participation. Rules are slightly different for Chris and myself. We only get 2 stamps per deep dive. First to get to bingo in any of the good, bad, and weird category cards get to choose a movie that they feel fits that category for Season 7.
Fantastic.
So what are your choices this time, Chris?
Under my bad card, I'm going to go with the baddiest kind of right for the Snow Lady.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I hate it, but she is technically right.
Yeah, he should have kept his mouth shut.
Gotta keep your mouth shut. And then I think for me, on my good card, I am going to go with beautiful cinematography. I really enjoyed it in this movie. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, the play-like staging of everything, how nicely everything's aged, and the emphasis of like spotlighting different aspects of it was some of my favorite stuff to watch.
Okay. You are getting real close to bingo on a couple of these.
I know. Cross my fingers here.
The Tim Allen one is
I know. I also
killing you there.
I'm not looking forward to Tim Allen.
I'm going to go with my weird card. I'm going to go with Why That Angle, because...
Yep, I thought about that one.
That is a very interesting... like, not knowing it, it feels like, okay, cool, there's a bunch of top-down shots, but then when you realize it's like, oh, it's the narrator who's talking about this. That's why it's this angle, so I'm going to go with that, Why That Angle.
Totally get it.
And for my good card...
Oh.
Chris dropped some good costuming and furniture knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good.
I paid attention in one class.
I did too. It's just
I just also had like 4 of them.
Yeah, I only had the 1, so... And I had to take it because our history or our architecture and film class got canceled.
Ah, bummer. That would have been cool.
Yeah. Rumiko Honda is responsible for me not being able to do that. She was writing a book, so...
Well, I guess that sounds important.
Yeah, but that's our first deep dive of Folktober. I'm really glad we did that as like our first one, just because
it's such a good entry to it.
And I'm glad you really liked it, just because I was a little worried with how long and slow it is.
It is long. I loved it. I will report, though, that the husband only liked one of them.
Shocker.
I know.
Yeah. But our next mic review is a little bit on the sillier side, so keep an eye out for that next week.
Yep.
And then our next deep dive is covering something a little bit more modern, but I'm learning is maybe a little bit off the beaten tracks unless you're into found footage films.
I'll be interested.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested on our socials, we are doing 31 days of Japanese Folktober, so.
Mostly Nico, because I have self-esteem and respect.
I do too. I'm watching good stuff. Don't throw me down into the trash pile, even though I am the trash king. So.
That's okay.
Yeah. But anywho, this has been the Good, the Bad, and the Weird Folktober.
Thanks for listening.
Peace. Thank you for stopping by this here town of the good, the bad, and the weird. We appreciate your listenership, and if you want more of our takes in your life, feel free to check us out on social media at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, or TGTBTW for short. As well, if we missed a fact, your favorite part of a movie, or just have a suggestion and want to reach out and say howdy, feel free to email us at tgtbtwpodcast@gmail.com. And feel free to join our Discord at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, where we talk about movies, just share random banter here and there. And always, check out our podcasters, streamers, or any other content creator we shout out in our episodes. We really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening. Peace!